The floor of the arena was warm under my feet, and it should not have been warm. I remember that detail more than anything else from that first day, because it told me something was alive underneath us, some machine breathing heat into the stone to keep the fighters sharp and awake. My hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, more from the fact that every instinct in my body was screaming that I did not belong in that circle, standing across from a creature built like a wall of muscle and horn, while a crowd of alien cadets watched from stone benches carved into the walls above. His name was Brune. I would learn that later. In that moment he was just 8 feet of gray hide and curved claws, lowering his head at me the way a bull lowers its head before a charge, and somewhere behind me a voice boomed out over the arena in a language that the translator chip behind my ear turned into rough, clipped words. Cadet designation unknown. First blood trial. Survive if you can. I want to explain how I got there, but there was no time to explain anything, because Brune was already moving. 3 days earlier, I had been asleep in a cryopod on a transport ship, one of thousands of colonists heading toward a new settlement on the edge of human space. I remember the cold first, then the light, then a voice that was not human, speaking words I did not understand, until the translator caught up and started feeding me meaning. There had been a mistake, a processing error at a shared transit station, one used by both human relocation ships and a much larger, much older power called the Krath Dominion. My pod had been rerouted, scanned, and logged under an empty slot meant for a cadet named Doran, a young Threxian who had backed out of his assignment at the last possible moment. Nobody had caught the error. Not the machines, not the officers, not me, until I was standing in a hallway made of dark metal, surrounded by beings twice my height with too many teeth, all of them staring at me like I was a joke someone had played on them. I could have said something right then. I could have told them I was human, that I was supposed to be on a colony ship, that this was clearly a mistake and I needed to go home. Looking back, I think about that moment more than any other, because it was the last moment where turning back would have been easy. But the officer processing new cadets barely looked at me. He read my scan results off a screen, muttered something about weak bone density and soft tissue, and waved me toward a barracks corridor without even asking my species. To him, I was just another late arrival, another disappointing recruit in a long line of disappointing recruits. And something in me, something stubborn and a little bit reckless, decided not to correct him. I told myself I would explain everything the next morning. I told myself it would be fine. It was not fine. It was Vantor Academy, a training world built for exactly one purpose, to take the most dangerous predator species in known space and turn them into elite soldiers for the Dominion war machine. Every cadet around me had claws, or venom, or 6 legs, or skin that could turn aside a blade. I had fingernails and a decent left hook I had learned from a boxing class back on Earth, and that was about it. By the time the sun rose over the academy the next morning, word had already spread that there was a new species among the cadets, something small and strange that the instructors were calling, with open contempt, the soft one. Nobody bothered to ask what I actually was. They had already decided I was harmless, and harmless was the worst thing you could be at Vantor. Which brings me back to the arena, and to Brune, and to the warm stone under my bare feet. He charged low, head down, aiming to catch me across the middle and throw me into the wall behind me. Every cell in my body wanted to freeze, but 4 years of amateur boxing had drilled one single lesson into my nervous system so deeply that it happened without thought. Do not stand still in front of the thing that wants to hit you. I stepped sideways, not far, just enough, and his shoulder clipped my arm instead of my chest. It still hurt. It felt like being hit by a slow-moving vehicle. I went down hard onto the warm stone, air punched out of my lungs, and the crowd above made a sound that was somewhere between laughter and disappointment. I got up. That was the part nobody expected. Brune turned around, confused, the way you might be confused if a bug you stepped on kept crawling. In the stands, a scarred instructor with pale eyes leaned forward slightly, watching me with new interest. I did not win that fight. I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story where the weak little human suddenly turns into an unstoppable fighter after one lucky moment. Brune caught me twice more, and both times hurt worse than the first, and both times I stood back up, slower, a little more crooked, my ears ringing. The trial ended when the horn sounded, and an official pulled Brune back, declaring the round over, not because I had lasted the distance or shown any impressive skill, but because I had refused, over and over, to stay down. Afterward, in the medical bay, a nurse of some insectile species ran a scanner over my ribs and made a series of clicking sounds that the translator rendered as pure disbelief. "This one should be resting for a week," she said to another nurse, not realizing or not caring that I could understand her. "Instead, he is asking when the next trial begins." She was right. I was asking exactly that, mostly because lying still gave my mind too much room to panic about everything I had gotten myself into. That night, in a barracks room built for a species twice my size, I lay on a cot too large for me and stared at a ceiling I could not see clearly in the dim light, and I let myself think, really think, about what I had done. I had let an entire alien military academy believe I was some unknown species instead of correcting a clerical mistake. I had walked into an arena against something built to end me. I had gotten up every single time it knocked me down. And somewhere underneath the pain and the fear and the sheer absurdity of it all, a small and stubborn part of me had started to enjoy proving them wrong. A voice spoke from the doorway before I had decided how I felt about that. "You are not supposed to still be conscious," it said. I turned to see a young Threxian cadet standing there, thin for his species, with dark markings across his face that seemed to shift slightly in the low light. He was studying me the way you might study a puzzle piece that did not fit the picture on the box. "Neither are you supposed to be standing in my doorway," I answered, and immediately wondered if that had been the wrong thing to say to a creature that could probably fold me in half. Instead, he made a sound I would later learn was something like laughter. "You fell down 4 times today," he said, "and you stood up 5. I do not know why, but that observation, more than anything else that had happened since I woke up in that cold cryopod, made something settle in my chest. Maybe it was the first time since arriving that someone had actually seen what I did, instead of simply seeing what I was not. His name was Doran, and though neither of us knew it yet, he would become the first thread in something that the Academy had never been designed to produce. Not a lone predator clawing its way to the top of a ranking chart, but something else entirely. Something built on numbers instead of claws, on patience instead of venom, on refusing to quit long after quitting would have made perfect sense. I did not sleep much that first night. Every part of my body ached in a way I had never experienced, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brune's shoulder coming toward me again. But somewhere in the gray hour before the artificial dawn lights came on, I made a decision that I would carry through everything that followed. I was not going to explain the mistake. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly what this place was, and exactly what I might be able to prove by staying in it. The horn that woke the barracks the next morning did not care about my decision, or my bruises, or the fact that I had barely slept. It simply sounded, loud and sudden, and every cadet around me rolled out of their bunks with the practiced efficiency of creatures who had been doing this their whole lives. I was the only one who fumbled, the only one who needed an extra few seconds to remember where I was and why everything hurt. An instructor's voice followed the horn, echoing down the stone corridor in that same clipped, translated tone from the day before. "All cadets to the outer field. Squad assignments begin today." I sat on the edge of my cot for a moment, flexing fingers that were still stiff from the fall, and I thought about turning back one more time. It would have been so easy to walk into the administration office and simply tell someone the truth. "I am human. There has been a mistake. Send me home." Instead, I laced up my boots, and I walked out into a morning full of creatures who could kill me without much effort, and I told myself the same thing I had been telling myself since the moment I woke up in that cryopod. I would explain everything later. For now, I just needed to survive one more day. I had no idea yet how many more days that decision would cost me, or how many it would end up saving. The days that followed taught me something the Academy itself never intended to teach, which is that pain becomes ordinary faster than you expect. By the end of the first week, my body had turned a strange shade of yellow and purple across both arms, and I had stopped flinching every time an instructor barked an order in my direction. What had not become ordinary was the way every alien cadet still looked at me sideways, the way you might look at something small and unusual that had wandered into a place it clearly did not belong. The training itself was built around a simple, brutal philosophy. Vantor Academy did not exist to teach discipline or strategy first. It existed to sort predators by raw capability, and only afterward to refine the ones who survived long enough to be worth refining. Every trial was designed around what these species were naturally good at, which meant every trial was designed around things I was naturally terrible at. There was the climb, a vertical obstacle course meant to test the claw grip and balance of species, built to scale cliffs and trees in the wild. I fell twice, caught myself with raw stubbornness the third time, and finished dead last, while cadets with natural climbing limbs finished before I had even reached the halfway mark. There was the chase, a timed run across broken terrain meant to test the explosive speed of ambush predators. Here, something strange happened. I did not win. I was not built for short bursts of speed the way they were, and the fastest cadets crossed the finish line long before me. But partway through the course, I noticed something the instructors had clearly not accounted for. While the fastest cadets tore ahead and then slowed, breathing hard, muscles burning from effort their bodies were not designed to sustain over distance, I kept moving, slower, steadier, but moving. By the final stretch, I had passed 3 cadets who had left me behind in the first 100 meters, cadets who were now doubled over with exhaustion while I jogged past them, exhausted myself but still upright. I finished 11th out of 30. It was the first time I had not finished last. The scarred instructor with pale eyes, whose name I eventually learned was Commander Skarn, watched that finish with an expression I could not quite read. He did not say anything to me directly. He simply made a note on a datapad and moved on to the next group of cadets. But I noticed him watching me more closely after that, the way a predator watches something it has not yet decided whether to underestimate. Doran found me afterward, sitting against a wall with my legs stretched out in front of me, trying to convince my lungs to slow down. "You are strange," he said, sitting down beside me without asking permission. "I get that a lot lately," I answered. "You should have lost that race in the first 100 meters," he continued. "Every calculation says you should have lost it." And yet, I agreed, because I did not have a better explanation myself. It turned out that my body, soft and weak by every metric the Academy cared about, had one significant advantage that none of the instructors' scoring systems accounted for. Human beings, whatever else we lacked, had spent tens of thousands of years as endurance hunters, chasing prey across open plains not through speed, but through sheer, patient persistence, outlasting animals that could outrun us easily in a sprint, but could not sustain that speed the way we could sustain our slower, steadier pace. Every species at Vantor had been built by evolution for the ambush, the ranked, explosive attack of a predator that expected its prey to tire and fall quickly. None of them had been built to keep going. I had been built for almost nothing else. It took me longer than it should have to understand what that meant, and even longer to figure out how to use it. The real turning point came during a bout that the instructors called simply the long match, a fighting trial where 2 cadets were placed in a sealed ring with no time limit, forced to continue until one of them could no longer stand. I was matched against a cadet named Vesa, a warrior caste female from a species called the Vresh, tall and lean, with retractable claws and reflexes that made my best boxing instincts look slow by comparison. I expected to lose quickly. Vesa clearly expected the same thing, because in the opening minute she came at me with a kind of casual confidence, testing my reactions rather than committing to a real attack. I ducked under her first strike, took a glancing hit from her second, and spent the first several minutes of that match doing almost nothing except surviving, absorbing what I could not avoid, moving when I could, learning the rhythm of her attacks the way you learn the rhythm of a song you have heard only once. By the 10th minute, something had changed in her stance. Small things. A slight delay before her strikes. A little less snap in her follow-through. Her species, like most at the Academy, was built for short and devastating engagements, not long grinding ones. The venom sacs along her forearms, meant to end a fight quickly, were of no use against an opponent who refused to let her land a clean hit in the way she needed to deliver them. By the 20th minute, I was tired, genuinely tired, my arms heavy and my legs unsteady beneath me. But Vesa was worse. Her breathing had become ragged in a way mine had not, her strikes coming slower and wider, her balance beginning to waver on landings that used to be effortless. I did not outfight her. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I outlasted her, and when the moment finally came, when her guard dropped for half a second longer than it should have because her body simply could not sustain the pace any longer, I stepped inside her reach and used a technique that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with leverage, one I remembered from a self-defense class years earlier on Earth, and I put her on the ground. The ring went quiet. Then the crowd of cadets watching from above erupted into a noise I had not heard directed at me before, something that was not laughter and was not contempt. Vesa sat up slowly, rubbing her jaw, and looked at me with an expression that had completely replaced the casual confidence from the start of the match. "That should not have worked," she said. "I know," I admitted. "I am as surprised as you are." She laughed then, a short, sharp sound, and extended a clawed hand toward me, palm up, which I would later learn was a gesture of respect among her people. I took it carefully, aware that those claws could open my arm without much effort, and shook it the human way, and something between us shifted from that moment forward. Word of that match spread through the barracks faster than any official announcement could have managed. By that evening, cadets I had never spoken to were watching me in the mess hall with open curiosity instead of dismissal. Brune, the massive gray cadet who had knocked me down 4 times on my first day, approached my table without a word and simply set down a portion of his own rations beside mine before walking away, which Doran later explained was, among his people, a peculiar form of apology. I do not want to make it sound as though everything suddenly became easy after that match, because it did not. I still lost far more than I won. I still finished near the bottom of most physical trials that measured raw strength or natural weaponry. I was still, by every traditional measure the Academy used, one of the weakest cadets in the entire program. But something had started, quietly, that no scoring system could measure. Cadets had begun watching how I fought, not just whether I won. Instructors had begun making notes instead of dismissive comments. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought had started to take root that I was not yet ready to say out loud, not even to Doran or Vesa. Maybe soft was not the same thing as weak. Maybe I had been measuring myself, this entire time, by rules that were never built for what I actually was. Commander Skarn approached me alone 2 nights later, while I sat outside the barracks in the cool evening air, still working out the aches from another day of trials. He did not sit down beside me the way Doran had. He simply stood, arms folded, studying me with those pale, scarred eyes for a long moment before speaking. "I have trained cadets from 40 different species," he said finally. "I have never seen one behave the way you behave." I did not answer right away, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "Your species designation in our records is incomplete," he continued. "It says Threxian, and yet you are not Threxian. It says very little else." My chest tightened. This was the moment I had been avoiding since the day I arrived, and some part of me had known it would eventually come. "There was a processing error," I said carefully, choosing each word. "When I arrived, Skarn's expression did not change. "I assumed as much some time ago," he said. "I have chosen not to report it yet." "Why?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "Because I want to see what happens first," he said, and then he turned and walked back toward the officers' quarters, without another word, leaving me sitting alone in the dark, with far more questions than I had answered. I did not sleep well that night either, though this time it was not pain keeping me awake. It was the knowledge that the truth was no longer entirely hidden, and that somewhere ahead, sooner or later, it was going to come out into the open, whether I was ready for it or not. The announcement came 3 days later, posted on the training board outside the mess hall in stark, glowing letters that every cadet gathered to read at once. Squad trials were beginning, a new phase of the Academy's program where individual cadets would be sorted into small units and tested not on personal strength, but on how well they could function as a group. For most of the cadets around me, this news was met with groans of frustration. Their entire lives had prepared them to hunt alone, to dominate alone, to prove themselves as individuals. The idea of depending on others felt to them like another kind of weakness. For me, it felt like coming home. I did not say that out loud, of course. I simply read the list of squad assignments posted beside the announcement, searching for my name among cadets I recognized, and felt something sink in my stomach when I found it. I had not been placed with Doran. I had not been placed with Vesa. I had been placed in a unit the other cadets were already calling, quietly and without much kindness, the Discard Squad. It was made up of 5 cadets, myself included, each of whom had been passed over by every other squad leader during the selection process for one reason or another. There was Grace, a lean predator from a species built for solitary ambush hunting, whose reflexes were excellent, but whose temperament made her nearly impossible to work alongside, according to every instructor's notes. There was Lucas, enormous and strong but slow-witted in a way that made the other cadets dismiss him instantly, despite an endurance that nearly matched my own. There was Ella, small for her species and considered fragile, whose sensory organs were so sensitive that loud environments left her disoriented and unable to function in typical training exercises. And there was Noah, a cadet whose species were pack hunters by nature, but who had been rejected from every pack squad because of an old injury that had left one of his limbs weaker than the rest. 5 rejects, thrown together not because anyone believed in us, but because nobody else wanted us. I remember standing with them for the first time in a training yard just after dawn, all of us sizing each other up with the same uncertain expression, and thinking that if the Academy wanted to prove a point about which cadets were worthless, they had assembled the perfect group to prove it with. Our assigned instructor, a stern officer named Kestrix who oversaw squad training, gathered us together and delivered a speech that was less an encouragement and more a formality. He clearly did not believe in himself. "You have 4 weeks before the first squad trial," he said, his tone flat. "Most squads in your position do not survive their first trial intact. I recommend you use the time to prepare for that outcome." Then he left, and the 5 of us stood there in silence, listening to the sound of other squads across the training yard already moving through coordinated drills with practiced ease, their movements sharp and confident in a way ours clearly were not. Grace was the first to speak, her voice edged with frustration. "This is a waste of time," she said. "None of us are suited to work together. That is why we are here." "I understand why you would think that," I said carefully, aware that I was, once again, the smallest and least physically impressive member of the group. "But I think we are looking at this the wrong way." Grace turned toward me with an expression that made it clear she did not think much of my opinion, but she did not walk away either, which I took as a small victory. "Every one of you has been rejected for the same reason," I continued. "Because this academy only knows how to measure individual strength. It does not know how to measure anything else. But that does not mean the thing it failed to measure in you does not exist. It just means nobody has bothered to look for it yet." Lucas, who had been silent until then, tilted his massive head slightly. "And you have looked?" he asked, not quite mocking but close to it. "I have an idea of where to start," I admitted, "because where I come from, Individual strength was never enough on its own. My species survived by working together, by communicating, by protecting each other even when it cost us something individually. It is the only advantage I have ever had here. I think, if we are willing to try, it could be an advantage for all of us. There was a long silence after that. Ella, standing slightly apart from the rest of the group, with her ears angled downward in what I had come to recognize as discomfort, finally spoke in a quiet voice. "Nobody has ever asked me to help before," she said. "They have only ever told me what I cannot do." I do not know exactly what shifted in that moment, but something did. Maybe it was simple desperation, the understanding that none of us had anywhere else to go, no other squad willing to take us, no other option except to try. Or maybe, and I like to believe this version more, it was the first time any of them had been offered a role that did not require them to be something they were not. We started small. I taught them the only thing I actually understood well, which was coordination, the kind of teamwork that came from something older than any single one of these species' evolutionary paths, something built into human history from the earliest tribes who survived only because they moved and fought and hunted as a unit rather than as individuals. I taught Grace to communicate her intentions instead of acting purely on instinct, to trust that Lucas would be exactly where he said he would be instead of assuming she needed to compensate for him. I taught Lucas to use his slow, deliberate strength as an anchor point that the rest of the squad could build strategy around, instead of apologizing for not being fast. I taught Ella that her sensitivity, the very thing that made typical training environments unbearable for her, made her the single best early warning system any of us had ever seen, capable of detecting movement and sound long before the rest of us noticed anything at all. And I taught Noah, whose old injury had cost him a place among his own kind, that a pack does not need every member to be identical in strength, only reliable in purpose. None of this came easily. There were arguments, plenty of them, moments where Grace's temper flared, and moments where Lucas grew frustrated at his own slowness, and moments where Ella simply shut down entirely, overwhelmed by an exercise that pushed her sensory limits too far. I made mistakes too, plenty of them, misjudging how much any of them could handle, forgetting that what worked for a human mind did not always translate directly into a Vresh, or a Threxian, or whatever unfamiliar biology stood in front of me. But slowly, over those 4 weeks, something began to take shape that the Academy had never intended to create, not 5 individually powerful predators competing for personal glory, but a single unit that moved and thought and reacted as something larger than the sum of its parts. The first squad trial arrived on a cold morning, held in a section of the training grounds designed to simulate a hostile forest environment, complete with artificial terrain, moving obstacles, and simulated threats that reacted to squad movement in real time. Our opponents were a squad ranked near the top of the entire cadet class, 5 cadets from strong, aggressive predator lines who had trained together since their earliest days at the Academy, and who looked, frankly, unbeatable on paper. Kestrix delivered the trial briefing with the same flat, disinterested tone he always used with us, clearly expecting the exercise to end quickly and predictably. "The objective is simple," he said. "Reach the central marker before the opposing squad, using any tactics available within the rules. Most matches of this type conclude within the first 10 minutes. Our match did not conclude within the first 10 minutes. I will not pretend the early part of the trial went smoothly. The opposing squad moved fast, aggressive and confident, pushing directly toward the central marker with the kind of overwhelming force that had clearly worked for them in every previous match. Grace wanted to meet that force head-on, and it took real effort to convince her that doing so would end the match in their favor within minutes. Instead, we did something the Academy's own training had never prepared its top cadets to face. We disappeared. Ella's sensitivity let us track the opposing squad's movement long before they had any idea where we were. Lucas became an immovable point that let the rest of us maneuver freely around him, knowing he could hold ground against nearly anything they threw at him. Noah, moving in coordinated bursts with Grace, drew the opposing squad's fastest members away from the group in a series of feints that made no sense to predators built to chase down a single, isolated target rather than recognize a deliberate diversion. And I moved through the gaps they left behind, using the terrain, using patience, using every ounce of endurance my body had, closing the distance to the central marker, not through speed or strength, but through simply refusing to be where they expected me to be. The opposing squad's leader, a massive cadet with a reputation for ending matches within minutes, realized far too late that his squad had been drawn apart, isolated from each other by an opponent that should have posed no threat at all. By the time he regrouped his cadets, I was already standing at the central marker, breathing hard, exhausted, and completely unharmed. The silence that followed in the observation gallery above was different from any silence I had experienced at the academy before. It was not confusion, and it was not the disbelief that had followed my match against Vesa. It was something closer to alarm. Kestrix did not offer congratulations. He simply stared at the outcome on his datapad for a long moment, then looked down at the five of us standing together at the central marker, and said nothing at all before walking away. That night, in the barracks, Doran found me again, sitting outside under the artificial stars that the Academy projected across its domed sky each evening. "Everyone is talking about the discard squad," he said, sitting down beside me. "Nobody expected that outcome." "Neither did I, honestly," I admitted. He was quiet for a moment, studying the projected constellations above us, patterns of light meant to mimic distant stars that none of us had ever actually seen from this world. "You are teaching them something the Academy does not know how to teach," he said finally. "I do not think the instructors understand what they are looking at yet." "I hope they never have to," I said, only half joking, because some part of me had already begun to suspect that our success would not go unnoticed for much longer, and that whatever came next would not be as simple as another training match. Over the following weeks, our squad kept winning. Not every match, but enough to draw real attention. We were reassigned twice, moved to increasingly difficult trials meant to test squads far more experienced than ours. Each time, the same pattern repeated itself. Our opponents relied on individual strength and instinct, and we relied on coordination, patience, and the willingness to sacrifice personal advantage for the good of the group, a concept that seemed to genuinely confuse predators who had spent their entire lives competing against each other rather than alongside anyone. The turning point came during a night exercise, a simulated hunt through dense artificial terrain against the Academy's top-ranked squad, a group of cadets so consistently dominant that most instructors considered the outcome a foregone conclusion before the match even began. We won that match without a single member of our squad sustaining serious injury, using nothing but coordinated misdirection, patience, and a psychological pressure that came from an enemy that refused to behave the way every instinct told them an opponent should behave. By the time it ended, the top-ranked squad's leader, a cadet whose reputation across the entire academy had gone unchallenged for years, stood in stunned silence at the edge of the simulated terrain, staring at the five of us as though he had just witnessed something that violated the basic rules of the universe he understood. Word of that victory spread through the entire academy within a single day, reaching far beyond the training yards and into conversations among instructors and administrators who had, until that point, paid little attention to a squad built from cadets nobody had wanted. It also, I would learn very soon, reached the office of the Academy's ruling council, the highest authority at Vantor, whose members had begun asking a question that Commander Skarn could no longer avoid answering. Who exactly was I? I was summoned to the administration tower 2 days after the night exercise, called out of morning training by an officer I did not recognize, who simply told me to follow without offering any explanation. I remember the walk across the academy grounds feeling much longer than it actually was, every step accompanied by a growing certainty that whatever waited for me at the top of that tower was not going to be pleasant. The council chamber was a wide, circular room with a high ceiling, ringed by seats occupied by senior officers and administrators I had never seen before, creatures from species I could not immediately identify, each of them studying me with an expression somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. Commander Skarn stood near the front of the room, his face unreadable, and beside him stood an older officer with silver markings across her face, whom I would soon learn was Overseer Castrella, the highest-ranking official at the entire academy. "Your records identify you as Threxian Cadet Doran," she said without any preamble, her voice carrying easily across the chamber. "And yet the Threxian Cadet Doran is currently standing in the training yard below us. Explain this discrepancy." There was no point lying. Not anymore. Not with an entire council staring at me, waiting for an explanation that clearly needed to satisfy them if I wanted to walk out of that room as anything other than a prisoner. "There was a processing error," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "When I arrived at the transit station, my cryopod was rerouted into an empty slot meant for a cadet who had already withdrawn. Nobody realized the mistake, including myself, until it was too late to correct it easily." A murmur ran through the assembled officers, low and uneasy. "And what species are you?" Castrella asked, her tone sharpening. "Human," I said, "from a colony fleet several transit stations away from here." The reaction to that single word was immediate and unmistakable. Several officers around the chamber exchanged glances, and one, a heavy-set creature near the back, made a low sound that the translator did not bother rendering into words, but that clearly conveyed contempt. "Humans," one officer said aloud, "are not predator species. They are not even considered military candidates by any recognized standard in this quadrant. This is not merely an administrative error, Overseer. This is a security concern. How do we know this was truly an accident, and not deliberate infiltration?" I felt my chest tighten at that accusation, the sheer absurdity of it colliding with how genuinely dangerous it was. An infiltrator, a spy, words that could easily end far worse than simple expulsion. "I did not choose this," I said, louder than I intended. "I woke up in a place I did not recognize, surrounded by creatures I had never seen before, and I made a choice to survive first and explain later. That is the entire truth. I have no interest in whatever conflicts exist between the Dominion and any other power. I am not a spy. I am simply someone who ended up somewhere he was never meant to be." "Then why did you not report the error immediately?" Castrella asked, her tone unreadable. That question was harder to answer honestly, because the honest answer was complicated even to myself. Because I was afraid, I admitted finally. Because the moment I arrived, everyone around me had already decided what I was capable of before I said a single word. They decided I was harmless, weak, not worth their attention. And some part of me wanted to know if that was actually true, or if it was simply the easiest conclusion for people to reach about something they did not understand. The chamber was quiet for a long moment after that. Commander Skarn spoke for the first time since I had entered the room, his voice calm and measured. "I have observed this cadet since his arrival," he said. "I chose not to report the discrepancy sooner because I wanted to understand what I was looking at first. What I have seen defies easy explanation. This cadet has been knocked down in every physical trial that measures strength, and has gotten up every single time. He defeated a warrior caste opponent not through power, but through endurance. He took 5 rejected cadets every other instructor at this academy had given up on, and built them into a unit capable of defeating our top-ranked squad without sustaining a single serious injury. Whatever else this cadet is, he is not harmless, and he is not what any of us expected a human to be." The officer who had accused me of infiltration was not satisfied. "This proves nothing except that the mistake should be corrected immediately," he said. "Expel him, return him to human space. This academy has no place for a species that was never meant to be here." Several other officers murmured agreement, and for a moment I genuinely believed that was going to be the outcome, that everything I had built over the past weeks, everyone I had come to know, was about to be taken away by a council that had already made up its mind before I entered the room. It was Vesa who spoke next, and I had not even realized she was present in the chamber until that moment. standing near a side entrance where I had not thought to look. "May I address the council?" she said, and though her tone remained respectful, there was an edge of challenge in it that made several officers turn toward her in surprise. "Speak," Castrella said. "I fought this cadet," Vesa said, "in a long match under full academy rules. I underestimated him because every part of my training told me to. He is smaller, weaker by any traditional measure, without natural weapons of any kind. And he defeated me, not through luck, and not through some accident of rules, but because he understood something none of the rest of us had been trained to understand. That strength is not only measured in the first minute of a fight. This academy exists to train warriors for the Dominion's future conflicts. If we expel every cadet who does not fit our existing definition of strength, without first testing whether that definition is even correct, we may be discarding exactly the kind of warrior we will need most." Another voice joined hers, and I turned to see Doran standing near the same entrance, having apparently followed Vesa into the chamber without official permission, an act of considerable risk for a cadet in a formal council session. "I have watched this cadet since his first night here," Doran said. "He does not fight the way we fight. He does not think the way we think, and that is precisely why he has succeeded where the rest of us would have failed. If this academy is meant to prepare the Dominion for threats we do not yet understand, expelling the one cadet who represents something genuinely unfamiliar seems like the opposite of wisdom." Castrella held up a hand, silencing the growing murmur of debate around the chamber, and studied me for a long, uncomfortable moment. "This academy operates under one principle above all others," she said finally. "Merit is proven through trial, not through birthright or origin. If this cadet's presence here was the result of an administrative error, that error can still be corrected through the same system that governs every cadet in this room. There is one trial remaining before this academy's ruling structure that has not been attempted by any cadet in recent memory, because it is considered too dangerous for cadets to willingly volunteer for it. It is called the Crucible. Historically, it has ended in serious harm even for our strongest apex predator cadets. If this human survives it, his place here will be considered earned beyond any further question, mistake or not. If he does not, the matter resolves itself, and this council need not concern itself further with how he arrived." The chamber fell silent, and I understood, with a cold certainty settling into my stomach, exactly what she was offering me. Not mercy, and not cruelty either, but the Academy's own brutal logic applied evenly, for once, in a way that at least gave me a genuine chance rather than a predetermined verdict. "I accept," I said, before I had fully finished thinking it through, because some part of me understood that hesitation in that chamber would be read as weakness, and weakness was the one thing I could not afford to show in that room. Castrella nodded once, apparently satisfied, and the council began discussing logistics as though I had already left the room, though I remained standing there for several more minutes before Skarn finally gestured for me to follow him out. In the hallway outside, once the heavy doors had closed behind us, Skarn stopped and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something almost like concern. "You understand what you have agreed to," he said. "I think so," I answered, though the truth was I understood only the broad outline, not the specifics. "The Crucible is not a controlled exercise like your squad trials," he said. "It uses live terrain, genuine hostile fauna native to this world, and it pits cadets not only against each other, but against threats the Academy does not fully control once the trial begins. Cadets have been seriously harmed. It exists specifically because the Dominion needs to know which of its future soldiers can survive genuine chaos, not simply a scripted test of strength." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "You could have let the Council's terms stand without warning me." "Because I do not believe you understand the scale of what is coming," he said. "And because, despite everything, I do not want to see this end badly for you." I appreciated that more than I knew how to say, though what I said instead was simpler. "Will my squad be allowed to enter with me?" Skarn considered the question for a long moment. "That has not yet been decided," he admitted. "But if you request it formally, I believe the Council may allow it, given the results your unit has already produced." "Then I request it," I said immediately. That evening, I gathered Grace, Lucas, Ella, and Noah together and told them everything: the mistake, the Council, the Crucible, all of it laid out plainly, with nothing held back. I expected some of them, perhaps all of them, to walk away once they understood the risk we were being asked to accept, especially now that they knew the cadet leading them had never even belonged at this academy in the first place. None of them left. Grace was the first to respond, her expression harder than I had seen it since our earliest days together. "You lied about your species," she said, "and I do not care." I blinked, caught off guard by how simply she said it. "You did not lie about anything that mattered," she continued. "You did not lie about training us. You did not lie about standing beside us in every trial since. Whatever you are, human or Threxian or something else entirely, that has not changed." Lucas nodded slowly in agreement, and Ella's ears lifted in a gesture I had come to recognize as something close to determination. Noah simply said, "We are a squad. Squads do not abandon each other over paperwork." I do not think I fully appreciated, until that exact moment, standing in a barracks room on a world I had arrived at entirely by accident, how much those 5 words meant to me. Somewhere in the weeks since my arrival, without quite noticing when it happened, this place had stopped being somewhere I was simply trying to survive, and had become somewhere I genuinely did not want to lose. The Crucible was scheduled for 6 days later, giving us barely enough time to prepare for something none of us fully understood. We spent every one of those days training harder than we ever had before, running through every scenario we could imagine, sharpening the coordination that had carried us through every trial so far, all while knowing that this one would be different in ways no amount of preparation could fully account for. On the night before the trial, I sat alone outside the barracks, under the projected stars one final time, and found myself thinking not about the danger ahead, but about the strange, accidental path that had brought me here. A clerical error, a translator glitch. A decision, made in fear and stubbornness, not to correct a mistake that could have sent me quietly home. And somewhere along that accidental path, I had found 4 companions who trusted me completely, an instructor who had chosen to protect me rather than expose me, and a version of myself I never would have discovered if everything had simply gone according to plan. Whatever waited in the Crucible tomorrow, I understood, standing there under those artificial stars, that I would face it exactly the way I had faced everything since my arrival, not as the strongest cadet in that arena, and not as the fastest, and certainly not as the most naturally dangerous. I would face it as the one who refused to stay down. The transport carried us out before dawn, 5 of us packed into a small vessel that descended through thick cloud cover toward a section of the planet the Academy rarely used, a wide stretch of untamed wilderness sealed off from the rest of the training grounds by kilometers of dense forest and jagged stone ridges. Nobody spoke much during the descent. Grace sat with her claws flexing slowly against her knees, a habit I had learned meant focus rather than nervousness. Lucas stared out the narrow viewport with an unreadable expression. Ella kept her ears pressed low, already bracing herself against a world she knew would overwhelm every sense she possessed. Noah checked and rechecked a strap on his gear that did not need checking at all. I did not know what to do with my own hands, so I simply held them together and tried not to think too hard about everything Skarn had told me. The transport set us down in a small clearing at the edge of the trial zone, where Overseer Castrella herself stood waiting alongside a handful of officers, their expressions unreadable in the pale early light. "The rules are simple," Castrella said, once we had disembarked and gathered before her. "You will proceed through the marked zone toward a central point roughly 12 kilometers from this location. You are not the only cadets participating today. 3 other squads, each ranked among the strongest in this academy, have also volunteered to enter the Crucible this cycle. The terrain contains native predators this world has never fully domesticated, creatures the Academy does not control once the trial begins. There is no guarantee of safety, and no trial officials will intervene once you cross that boundary. Survival and success depend entirely on you." She turned her attention directly toward me. "Should you and your squad reach the central point, your place at this academy will be considered settled beyond further question, regardless of the circumstances of your arrival. Should you fail to reach it, or fail to survive the attempt, that question resolves itself as well." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant, without needing further explanation. "Good fortune, cadets," she said, and stepped back, gesturing toward the tree line ahead of us. We crossed into the crucible together, the 5 of us moving as we always did now, without needing to discuss formation, each of us settling naturally into the roles we had built over weeks of training. Ella took point, her sensitive senses already straining against the unfamiliar sounds of the wild forest around us. Lucas moved just behind her, steady and unhurried, ready to anchor any confrontation that came from ahead. Grace and Noah moved along our flanks, watching for movement from the sides, and I stayed near the center, coordinating our pace and watching for anything the others might miss. The forest itself felt alive in a way the training grounds never had. Massive trees rose high overhead, their canopy thick enough to dim the daylight into a permanent dusk, and the ground beneath us shifted between soft moss and jagged root systems that made every step deliberate. Within the first hour, Ella froze suddenly, one hand raised to halt the rest of us. "Something is moving to the left," she said quietly, large, low to the ground. We adjusted course without a word, giving the unseen threat a wide berth, and continued on. It was the first of many such moments over the following hours, each one a small test of the trust we had built together, each one passing without serious incident because we moved as a unit rather than as 5 separate individuals hoping to survive on their own. The real danger arrived just past the halfway point, where the forest opened into a wide rocky basin that we needed to cross to continue toward the central marker. We were halfway across the open ground when Grace spotted movement along the ridge above us, and within seconds it became clear we were not the only squad in that basin. A rival squad, one of the top-ranked units that had entered the crucible alongside us, emerged from the tree line on the opposite side, clearly intending to cross the same open ground toward the same objective. Their leader, a broad and heavily armored cadet I recognized from earlier trials, spotted us immediately and altered course, apparently deciding that eliminating a competing squad was a more efficient path to victory than simply racing us to the marker. There was no time for careful strategy. They closed the distance fast, confident in their numbers and their strength, and for a moment, standing exposed in that open basin, I felt the same fear I had felt on my very first day in the arena against Brune. But this time, I was not standing there alone. Lucas moved forward without needing to be told, planting himself as an anchor point the rest of us organized around instinctively. Grace and Noah split wide, drawing 2 of the rival squad's fastest members away from the central engagement exactly as we had practiced, exactly as we had done in the night exercise weeks earlier. Ella, despite the chaos of sound and movement threatening to overwhelm her, held her position and called out warnings that let the rest of us react half a second before we otherwise would have, a margin that made all the difference. I do not remember every detail of what followed, only fragments, the desperate scramble across uneven rock, the sound of Lucas holding ground against an opponent twice his size, the moment Grace and Noah reunited after drawing their targets into a position where the terrain itself worked against them rather than us. What I remember most clearly is the ending, the moment the rival squad's leader, having lost track of his own unit in the confusion we had deliberately created, found himself facing me alone in the center of the basin, certain that the smallest and weakest member of our squad would be the easiest target remaining. He came at me with the same overwhelming confidence every predator at this academy had shown me from the very first day, certain that raw strength would end things quickly. And once again, exactly as I had done since my very first fall in that arena weeks earlier, I did not meet that strength with strength of my own. I met it with patience, with movement, with the accumulated exhaustion of a chase across an entire basin that had worn down his stamina in ways his own instincts had never prepared him to manage. When the opportunity finally came, a half-second of overextension born purely from frustration, I took it, using leverage and positioning rather than force, and brought the engagement to an end without serious harm to either of us. The rival squad, scattered and disorganized, chose to withdraw rather than continue an engagement that had stopped going according to their expectations entirely. We did not pursue them. Our objective had never been to defeat every squad in that basin, only to reach the marker ahead, and by the time the rocky ground fell silent again, we resumed our course toward the center of the trial zone, bruised but intact, all 5 of us still standing together. The final stretch of the crucible brought its own challenge, a native predator far larger than anything we had encountered so far, territorial and aggressive, guarding the approach to the central marker in what felt less like an accident of terrain and more like a deliberate final test built into the trial itself. It moved with a silent, deliberate menace that made even Grace hesitate, and for a long moment, our squad stood at the edge of its territory, uncertain how to proceed. "This is different," Noah said quietly. "This is not another squad. This is not something that gets tired the way we do." He was right, and I knew it. Whatever advantage endurance gave me against another predator cadet meant far less against something native to this world, built for exactly this environment, without the same limitations our training had exploited so effectively until now. But endurance was not the only lesson I had carried with me from Earth. Somewhere in the back of my mind, standing at the edge of that clearing, I remembered something else entirely, older even than the endurance hunting that had defined so much of my species' history. The understanding that intelligence, patience, and cooperation had always mattered more to human survival than any single physical advantage ever had. "We do not need to defeat it," I said slowly, an idea forming even as I spoke it aloud. "We only need to get past it." Working together, using Ella's sensitivity to track its exact movement, using Lucas as a visible distraction it could not ignore, using Grace and Noah's speed to create false paths that scattered its attention across multiple directions at once, we did something none of us could have managed alone. We moved around it rather than through it, exploiting confusion rather than confronting strength directly, and by the time it fully understood it had been outmaneuvered, our squad had already slipped past its territory and reached the tree line beyond, the central marker finally visible ahead of us through the thinning forest. We crossed that final stretch together, all 5 of us, exhausted, injured in small ways, but alive, and when we reached the marker and the trial's completion signal sounded across the entire zone, I felt something settle inside me that I had been carrying since the very first moment I woke up in that cryopod weeks earlier, uncertain and afraid and utterly out of place. The transport that retrieved us afterward carried us back to the academy in near silence, though it was a different kind of silence than the one that had accompanied our descent that morning. Castrella herself was waiting when we arrived, along with Commander Skarn, and a growing crowd of cadets who had gathered near the landing platform once word spread that our squad had returned. "The Council has reviewed the results," Castrella said once we had disembarked. "Of the 4 squads that entered the Crucible today, only 2 returned without serious injury. Yours was among them, despite entering with the least individually capable cadets by our own academy standards." She turned to look directly at me. "The question of your origin, cadet, is no longer in dispute. Whatever mistake brought you here, this academy's own rules have settled the matter beyond further argument. You have earned your place through trial, as every cadet must, and that place is no longer contingent on which species you happen to be born into." The crowd of cadets behind her, cadets who had once called me the soft one with open contempt, watched in a silence that had nothing left of mockery in it at all. Doran was the first to step forward, extending an arm in the same gesture Vesa had once offered me after our own match, and I took it without hesitation. Vesa followed, And then, to my genuine surprise, Brune approached as well, offering the same gesture with none of the casual dismissal he had shown me on that very first day. Word of what happened in the Crucible spread far beyond Vantor Academy in the days that followed, carried through Dominion channels to other training worlds, other command structures, other officers who had spent generations assuming that humanity's absence from their military academies simply reflected a species too fragile to matter. That assumption did not survive contact with the truth of what a single accidental cadet, and the squad he had built from cadets nobody else wanted, had managed to accomplish. I stayed at Vantor long after that day, no longer hiding what I was, no longer needing to. My squad remained together, training other cadets in the methods that had carried us through trials nobody expected us to survive, and slowly, quietly, the academy that had once dismissed an entire species as harmless began reconsidering exactly what harmless truly meant. I think back sometimes to that first morning, standing across the arena from Brune with shaking hands and no idea what I had gotten myself into, and I understand now what none of us could have known then. That strength was never only measured in claws or venom or raw physical power. That the alien warriors who once looked at me with contempt had simply never encountered a predator built the way humanity was built. Patient, cooperative, and utterly unwilling to stay down. They do not call me the soft one anymore. These days, when new cadets arrive at Vantor and ask about the human who once stumbled into this academy by accident, the older cadets tell them a simpler truth instead. He is the reason we no longer underestimate what harmless might actually mean.